I wanted to touch on New York and London. You mentioned looking out, and we see price per square foot in places like Manhattan at $3,500 price per square foot, even upwards to $4,000. London, Paris, Tokyo, even like Vancouver is topping
San Fran, Boston,
And then when you look at Toronto, it's at $1,200 on an average. Right. And so people will always ask, like, how sustainable is this? I think we have lots more room to grow.
We're just getting started.
Yeah. So if I can address that for you guys, like, because we spend a ton of time trying to understand this. As cities become global, we'll call them, and I think we can all agree that Toronto, you can argue over how global and are we New York? No. Okay, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that we're not Saskatoon, right? Like, I mean, so we're somewhere in between. And as cities become, I hope there's nobody from Saskatoon.
I was about to say, anyone who's listening to
Saskatoon is lovely.
We still love
I enjoy.
It's just, we're just talking about population.
I enjoy it there immensely.
So do I. And I'm more talking about the population.
Like, there's literally people who said those Toronto people, and they just clicked off.
I
Hopefully
love the Rough Riders as well. Saskatchewan. I love that.
Big time.
Okay, so we've got that under control. Point being is that we feel Toronto and Vancouver are different and considered global in nature. So what that does is it reverses or spurs capital flow. So it's not just about in cities like, we'll use Winnipeg this time.
Okay.
Typically the people who buy real estate are those who use it every time, right? I'm either living there or renting there or doing something. In cities like Toronto, there's people who buy real estate who have nothing to do with Toronto. They own it, and somebody's got to rent it or whatever. But there's all kinds of, we're neighbors. We own a property in Yorkville at 101 Yorkville. Our neighbor is a German international who's been to Canada like 3 times, and he owns it, and he's owned it for 50 years. Like, these aren't speculators. They're people who see Canada and see Toronto, right? So they see Canada as a safe, very sort of stable country, rule of law, right? All those things, currency stability, and then banking stability. And then they look at Toronto as its major epicenter and the diversified employment base and all the things that we like about the GTA in Toronto. And they buy there and they hold there. So what that does is it creates demand for scarce real estate that's not only coming from the people in the community, but it's coming from everywhere in the world. And that pushes prices up. Now, what you have to be cognizant of, and when people talk about bubbles, okay, so a bubble is when the market disconnects from the local fundamentals, okay? So what that means is prices have been pushed up by all these people from Germany and everywhere else, and the people who use it, right, Torontonians, whether they're business owners or whether they're residents, can no longer afford it. That's a bubble, right? So that gap is when things blow up, when capital flow reverses because they don't like Canadian policy, or there's a better deal in the US, or the government changes corporate tax, right? That money leaves and that bubble deflates because it goes back to the fundamentals of the market. So when you look at the fundamentals of the market, back to the point of, it's not just affordability of ownership, it's can I rent it? And that is still very connected. So when we look at how much runway's left, and I talk a lot on panels, and I get a lot of questions from investors who always say, well, it's got to stop. And my question to them is always, okay, why? Like, so I'm happy to talk about my feelings.
Yeah.
But if you can give me one statistical data point that supports, right? Like, if you look at where the economy is, where employment is, where interest rates are headed, all of those factors in terms of stability of Canada, generally speaking. And then when you look at rents to prices and affordability, that all is in line. And then when you look at the macro level, 150,000 people every single year, boom, 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 boom. And if I want to cut down a tree branch for my little house reno, it takes me 12 months.
Right.
Okay, so no problem. Try building a 250 or 350 unit building and see how much red tape you have to get through to actually get that online.
Now, so Jas, I just wanted to touch on a point because we're at a high level, kind of an economy matter. And I had a conversation actually yesterday with a client from Calgary. The gentleman is a C-level executive at one of the oil firms. So it was a really good discussion. I'm just going to touch on a couple points. The difference, kind of the case that you're making for Toronto, which is factual. In my eyes, it's fact. Well, we're living it, we're breathing it. We've actually worked in it for a decade. It's almost, at this point to me, it's almost insulting to have to defend Toronto. If you don't get it, I'm so sorry. If 10 years of data cannot teach you something, then you're beyond the scope of me. So Calgary, so I'm having this discussion, and this is a very, very bright man, much brighter than me. He represents the interests of a very large company. And he is watching, I shared it with Chris Slightum. They're watching tens of millions flee Calgary for the last 3 years per day. That means, but that's, and some people call Calgary a bubble bust. That is not a bubble. Calgary was in line perfectly with the economy and what was happening at the time. Calgary and Alberta in general are an energy market. The problem in Alberta is that their government never diversified the economy outside of the commodities. If you're in commodities, as many of you may know, those are cyclical. One drought and the corn goes in Saskatchewan, corn is going up. The whole province is screwed. Lentils, water, forestry in BC. So like when your market is directly tied to a commodity, you're much more volatile. Toronto, going back to Toronto now, because people want to make the same case, and it's just you're in a different library, let alone in the same chapter.
You're comparing apples and oranges.
Correct.
Right?
So here we're service based.
Right.
Every global company has an office in Toronto. It's much more difficult for us to get hurt.
We have a resilient market and a resilient base. Like my firm's been investing here for 16 years, and we have investors in 32 different countries. And when I travel around the world and talk to some of those investors, it's funny because their assumption is like, well, you're from Toronto, so you invest in Toronto. I'm like, that has nothing to do with why we invest in Toronto. Zero. Like we have a healthcare business. 100% of the dollars we've ever deployed in its history are in the US. We've never invested in a Canadian company. It's not like I'm afraid to go to other markets. It's that this concoction of ingredients, the supply constraints, the demand, everything about it is made this the best market to invest in the world, hands down.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching and listening. Please take a second right now to subscribe and follow us on whatever podcast platform you're watching or listening. It means the world to me. Thank you.